Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. How does a nation of more than 7,000 islands, stretching across 1,000 miles of open ocean, home to over 100 different languages, become the only Catholic country in all of Asia? Not just Catholic in name, Catholic in the bones. Catholic in the way a grandmother lights a candle before dawn. Catholic in the way a jeepney driver touches his forehead passing a church. Catholic in the way an entire barangay gathers for a fiesta and nobody questions why. How does that happen? You might say, well, the Spanish came. They brought the cross. They converted everyone. Simple. But if you think about it for more than a minute, you realize nothing about that answer makes sense, because the Spanish also went to China. They tried to enter Japan. They pushed into the Spice Islands. And none of those places became Catholic. Not even close. So what was different about the Philippines? That is the question at the heart of today's story. And the answer will take us back to the year 1565. To a small fleet of ships arriving on the shores of Cebu, carrying soldiers, sailors, and 5 Augustinian friars who had no idea they were about to set in motion one of the most extraordinary religious transformations in human history. This is a story about the sword and the cross, about Legaspi the conquistador and Ordinator the priest navigator, about friars who learned Tagalog in 2 years and wrote grammar books before some European languages even had theirs, about a bishop who was threatened at gunpoint for defending Filipino farmers, and about the Filipino people themselves, who did not simply accept a foreign faith. They reshaped it, reimagined it, and made it something no one in Rome or Madrid could have ever predicted. This is the story of how Philippine Catholicism was born, not in triumph, but in tension, not in agreement, but in argument. And that tension, that beautiful, unresolved tension between faith and power, between the gospel and the garrison, that is what made Philippine Catholicism unlike anything else on earth. Let us begin. Before we talk about 1565, we need to understand what came before. Because the arrival of Legaspi and the Augustinians was not Spain's first attempt at the Philippines. It was not even the second, or the third, or the fourth. After Ferdinand and Magellan's expedition reached the Philippines in 1521 and established the first contact between European Christianity and the people of these islands, Spain spent the next 4 decades trying and failing to come back. In 1525, the Loaiza expedition set out to retrace Magellan's route. It was a catastrophe. 7 ships and 450 men sailed from Spain. Storms scattered them in the Strait of Magellan. The fleet commander, Garcia Jofre de Loaiza, did not survive the crossing. His successor also perished of the entire expedition. Only a handful of men reached the Pacific Islands alive, broken, starving, and stranded thousands of miles from home, with no way back. Among those survivors was a young Basque man named Andres de Ordinator, barely 27 years old, who spent the next 8 years marooned in the Spice Islands, before finally finding passage back to Europe. Remember that name. He would spend the next 40 years carrying the memory of that terrible journey, and it would shape everything that came after. In 1528, Alvaro de Saavedra tried again. Sailing from the Pacific coast of Mexico, he reached the islands, attempted twice to find the return route eastward, and twice was beaten back by contrary winds. His ships were swallowed by the vastness of the Pacific. Saavedra himself did not survive to see land again. In 1542, Fray Pérez de Villalobos led yet another expedition. It was Villalobos who actually gave the islands the name Los Islas Filipinas, in honor of the future King Philip II. But like every attempt before him, Villalobos could not establish a permanent settlement, could not find the return route to Mexico, and the Portuguese, who jealously guarded their control of the Spice Islands nearby, drove him away. Villalobos perished in the Moluccas, far from home, having accomplished nothing lasting, for expeditions, for failures. Hundreds of lives lost to storms, starvation, disease, and the sheer indifference of the Pacific Ocean, for expeditions, for failures. And the central problem was always the same: not reaching the Philippines. We're getting back. The Pacific winds that carried ships westward to Asia were reliable enough. But finding a route eastward, back to Mexico, against those same winds, that was the puzzle nobody could solve. Without a return route, any settlement in the Philippines would be completely cut off from resupply. It would wither and collapse, just as every previous attempt had done. By the early 1560s, King Philip II decided to try one more time, and this time, he wanted the one man who might actually solve the navigation problem: Andres de Urdaneta, the survivor of the Loaiza disaster, who was now an aging Augustinian friar living quietly in a monastery in Mexico City. Urdaneta did not want to go. He was in his late 60s. He had already crossed the Pacific once, decades ago, and the memory of what he endured, the starvation, the storms, the burials at sea, still haunted him. When Philip II personally requested him for the expedition, Urdaneta agreed to serve as navigator, but refused to command. He would guide the ships, but he would not lead the conquest. That role would fall to another Basque man, a 60-year-old colonial administrator with no military experience, and a reputation for being cautious, diplomatic, and surprisingly gentle for a conquistador. His name was Miguel López de Legaspi, and so, in November 1564, from the port of La Navidad on the Pacific coast of Mexico, a small fleet of 5 ships set sail. On board were approximately 400 men, soldiers, sailors, administrators, and 5 Augustinian friars, Urdaneta himself, Martin de Roda, Diego de Herrera, Pedro de Gamboa, and Andres de Aguirre, 5 friars for an entire archipelago. Think about that for a moment. 5 men of prayer, sailing into a chain of more than 7,000 islands, home to hundreds of thousands of people speaking scores of different languages, with customs, beliefs, and social structures completely unlike anything in Europe. 5 men, armed with nothing but their faith, their breviaries, and whatever linguistic talent God had given them. They had no idea what awaited them, but what awaited them would change Asia forever. The Legaspi expedition reached the Philippines in the spring of 1565. After a brief stop in the southern islands, they made their way to Cebu, arriving on April 27th. Now, Cebu was not unfamiliar territory for the Spanish. This was the same island where Magellan had arrived 44 years earlier, where he had celebrated that famous mass, baptized the local ruler, and ultimately met his end in the Battle of Mactan at the hands of Lapu-Lapu's warriors. The memory of Magellan's fate hung over the expedition like a shadow. Every Spaniard on those ships knew the story. They knew that the people of these islands were not passive. They were proud, organized, and fully capable of defending their homeland. Legaspi, to his credit, chose a different approach. Where Magellan had been bold and somewhat reckless, Legaspi was cautious. He sought to establish alliances rather than force submission. He performed the traditional blood compact, the Sandugo, with the local chieftain, Datu Tupas, binding their peoples in a symbolic brotherhood of shared blood. And then, something remarkable happened. While Legaspi's men were exploring the burned remains of a settlement on the coast of Cebu, a soldier stumbled upon something in the ashes of a destroyed hut. It was a wooden box, blackened by fire, and inside that box, perfectly preserved, was a small wooden statue of the Christ child. This was the Santo Niño, the very same image that Magellan had given as a baptismal gift to the wife of Roger Humabon 44 years earlier, when she received the sacrament of baptism and took the Christian name Juana. 44 years of wars, raids, fires, and upheaval, And yet this small statue survived, untouched and unbroken, waiting in the ruins. For the Augustinian friars, this was not coincidence, this was providence. This was God saying, I was here before you arrived, and I have been waiting. Legaspi named the settlement Villa del Santissimo Nombre di Jesus, the town of the most holy name of Jesus. Urdaneta established the first churches on the island, Street Vitalis, and the original chapel that would eventually become the Basilica del Santo Nico. He served as the first prelate of the church in Cebu and earned a title. That tells you everything about his character, protector of the Indians. But Urdaneta would not stay long in the Philippines. Legaspi had a crucial mission for him, the one mission that mattered more than anything else. Find the return route to Mexico, solve the puzzle that had defeated every previous expedition. In June 1565, Urdaneta set sail eastward from the Philippines, carrying nothing but his navigation instruments, his calculations, and his prayers. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of navigation in the history of the sea. He sailed north from the Philippines, caught the Corosio Current and the westerly winds at higher latitudes, and then rode those winds all the way across the Pacific to the coast of California, and from there south to the port of Acapulco. The journey covered 12,000 miles and took 130 days. 14 members of the crew did not survive the voyage when the ship finally reached Acapulco. Only 2 men had enough strength left to drop the anchors, Urdaneta himself and a young man named Felipe de Salcedo, who was Legaspi's own grandson. This route, the Tornavage, the return voyage, would be used for the next 100 years by the Manila galleons, the great trading ships that connected Asia to the Americas. Every silk garment, every porcelain vase, every spice, and every piece of silver that crossed the Pacific for 2 centuries followed the path that one elderly Augustinian friar charted in 1565. Urdaneta never returned to the Philippines. He went back to his monastery in Mexico City, where he passed away 3 years later, in 1568. But the route he discovered ensured that the Philippine colony would survive. Supplies, reinforcements, and most importantly, more missionaries could now reach the islands. The door that Urdaneta opened would never close again. With Urdaneta gone, the burden of spiritual leadership in the Philippines fell on the shoulders of another Augustinian, Fray Martin de Roda. Roda was younger than Urdaneta, born in 1533. He was in his early 30s when the expedition reached Cebu. He was brilliant, zealous, and unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths. And the truths he saw in the Philippines were deeply uncomfortable indeed. From the very beginning, there was a fundamental tension at the heart of the Spanish enterprise. The official mission was twofold: conquest and evangelization. The sword and the cross, working together. But in practice, these 2 goals were often at war with each other. Soldiers wanted tribute, labor, and obedience. Friars wanted genuine conversion, willing hearts, and the protection of their new flock. Rada threw himself into the work of evangelization with extraordinary energy. He learned the local languages with remarkable speed. He established the first proper wooden church in Cebu in 1571, sponsored by 2 devoted Santo Niño followers, Don Gabriel and Doña Catalina Sanchez. He baptized, taught, counseled, and built. Within a few years, he had become, in the words of later historians, the founder and spiritual father of the Catholic Church in the Philippines. But Roda also saw what the soldiers were doing. He saw the forced labor. He saw the excessive tribute collections. He saw Filipino farmers beaten for failing to meet impossible quotas, and in 1574, he wrote a letter that would become one of the most important documents of early Philippine history. In that letter, Rada declared plainly, not a single island in the Philippines had come under Spanish control by legitimate means. Instead of arriving as friends, he wrote, The Spanish had gone everywhere with the mailed hand, winning converts and subjects through fear rather than friendship. This was a friar writing to his superiors, publicly accusing his own countrymen of injustice. In the 16th century, this was an act of extraordinary moral courage. Rada was essentially saying, "We came here to save souls, but what we are actually doing is stealing lives." Rada would go on to lead the first missionary expedition to China in 1575, hoping to open another door for the gospel. He did not live to see the full consequences of his advocacy, but his voice would echo through the decades that followed, planting seeds of conscience that would soon bear dramatic fruit. Now let us talk about how the Augustinians actually went about their work, because the sheer scale of the challenge they faced was almost absurd. 5 friars, later reinforced by small groups, but never enough, trying to bring the Catholic faith to an archipelago that stretched over 1,000 miles, populated by hundreds of thousands of people who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and lived in small, scattered communities along rivers, coastlines, and mountain ridges. The first thing the friars did was something that surprised even the colonial authorities. They started learning languages, not Spanish imposed on Filipinos. Filipinos' languages learned by Spaniards. The Augustinians devoted themselves to mastering Tagalog, Bisaya, Ilocano, Kapampangan, and other local tongues with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Within 2 years, many of them could preach, hear confessions, and conduct catechism in the vernacular. And they did not stop at speaking. They wrote, they compiled vocabularies, they analyzed grammar, they created dictionaries. By 1593, less than 30 years after the first Augustinians arrived, the Doctrina Christiana was published in Manila, the first complete book printed in the Philippines, rendered in both the Latin alphabet and the traditional Baybayin script. Think about the significance of that. The very first printed book in Philippine history was a catechism, produced by missionaries who had learned the local language well enough to translate complex theological concepts into Tagalog. By 1610, the Dominican friar Francisco Blancas de San Jose published the Arte y Reglas de la Lengua Tagala, the first formal grammar of the Tagalog language. By the end of the Spanish colonial period, missionaries had written at least 120 grammars of Philippine languages. 120. The grammar of Tagalog was formally documented before several European languages had theirs written down. Let that sink in. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Because these linguistic achievements were not performed in a vacuum, they were part of a larger system. A system designed not only to save souls, but to consolidate colonial control. And the most powerful tool in that system was a policy called reduction. Reduction, from the Spanish word meaning reduction, or gathering, was the practice of resettling scattered indigenous communities into centralized towns, built around a church and a plaza, before the Spanish arrived. The Filipino population lived in barangays, small, independent communities of 30 to 100 families, typically settled along rivers, coastlines, or in upland valleys. These communities were self-governing, led by deities, with their own customs, their own spiritual leaders, and their own rhythms of life. Reduction shattered all of that under orders from the colonial government. Families were uprooted from their ancestral lands and relocated to new settlements, designed according to a specific plan laid out by King Philip II in his ordinances of 1573. The church stood at the center. The plaza spread before it. The town hall faced it. Schools and convents flanked it. Every home, every field, every market had to be within hearing distance of the church bell. This concept had a name: Bajo de Campana, under the bell. The bell did not merely call people to prayer, it structured their entire existence. It rang for waking, It rang for work. It rang for the Angelus. It rang for curfew. Your day began and ended with that bell. Your week revolved around Sunday Mass. Your year was measured by saints' feasts and liturgical seasons. The bell was not decoration. It was control. And the church plaza was not just an open space. It was a microcosm of the ideal Catholic society that Spain was trying to build. The physical arrangement of the town taught a lesson without words. God is at the center. Authority radiates from God. You live within the sound of his voice. Reduction was not unique to the Philippines. The same policy had been applied in Peru, where Viceroy Toledo resettled approximately 14 million indigenous people into 840 communities in the 1570s. It was used in Mexico, California, and across the Spanish Americas, but in the Philippines, its effects were particularly profound because of the extremely dispersed nature of the barangay system. Moving from a riverside hamlet of 50 families to a centralized town of several hundred was not just a change of address. It was the destruction of an entire way of life. Farming routines were disrupted, kinship networks were broken, ancestral lands were abandoned, and concentrated living brought new dangers. Diseases spread faster in crowded settlements, and epidemics that might have passed over scattered communities now ravaged entire towns. Many Filipino communities resisted. Some simply packed up and fled deeper into the mountains or the interior forests, becoming what the Spanish called remontados, those who went back to the hills. In some cases, entire villages vanished overnight, their residents choosing the hardship of the wilderness over the suffocating order of the Reduction town. Others resisted more openly, and it was often the Babaylan, the traditional spiritual leaders, frequently women, who led the resistance for the Babaylan. Reduction was not merely a political imposition, it was a spiritual invasion. The church bell was drowning out the voices of the ancestors. The plaza was built on land that might have held a dambana, a sacred place of indigenous worship. The new calendar of saints' feasts was replacing the old calendar of planting, harvesting, and ancestor remembrance. The Tambot uprising in Bohol in 1621 was led by a Babaylan, who called his people to reject the foreign faith and return to their ancestral beliefs. The Bengal Revolt in Light in 1622 was similarly motivated. A native chief who had been among the first to accept baptism turned against the friars and called for a restoration of the old ways. These uprisings were suppressed, their leaders punished, but they testified to something important. The conversion of the Philippines was never as smooth or as complete as the official records suggest. Beneath the surface of Catholic conformity, older loyalties persisted, older gods were remembered, and older ways of understanding the world continued to pulse like an underground river. But not everyone resisted. And this is where the story becomes most interesting, because many Filipinos chose to engage with the new faith, not because they were forced, but because they found something in it that resonated with what they already believed. Mass baptism was widespread in the early decades of evangelization. By some estimates, around 150,000 Filipinos had been baptized by the mid-16th century. The Spanish missionaries celebrated these numbers as proof of their success. But the reality was more complex. Many Filipinos associated this sacrament of baptism with their own indigenous healing rituals, which also used the symbolic power of holy water. To be baptized was, in their understanding, not just to receive a new faith, it was to be healed, cleansed, and protected by a powerful new spiritual force. Was this genuine conversion? That is a question that haunted the missionaries then, and it haunts historians now. The answer, as with most things in Philippine history, is not simple. It was both. It was neither. It was something entirely new, alongside Reduction. There was another system that shaped the encounter between faith and power, the encomienda. Under this system, formalized for the Philippines by King Philip II in a law dated June 11, 1594. Spanish colonists were granted the right to collect tribute, taxes, from indigenous communities, in exchange for providing religious instruction and military protection. In theory, it was a fair trade. In practice, the encomenderos, the tribute collectors, exploited the system ruthlessly. They demanded excessive tribute, imposed forced labor known as polo y servicios, compulsory labor on public works, road construction, shipbuilding, and logging, and used their position to enrich themselves at the expense of the very people they were supposed to protect. The tribute system created a perverse incentive structure. The more Filipinos you had under your encomienda, the more tribute you could collect, and the more tribute you collected, the wealthier and more powerful you became. Some encomenderos treated their Filipino charges with a minimum of decency. Many did not. Reports of beatings, theft, and the seizure of rice harvests, leaving families with nothing to eat, were common enough that they reached the ears of the king in distant Madrid. The polo y servicios was particularly hated. Filipino men could be drafted for 40 days per year of unpaid labor, later reduced to 15 days. But even that was an enormous burden on farming families who depended on every able-bodied person. For the planting and harvest seasons, families paid a thala, a fine, to be exempted. But the fine itself was often more than a poor farmer could afford. It was a system designed to extract maximum labor and maximum wealth from a population that had no voice in how it was governed. And here is the crucial connection. The encomienda and the mission system were intertwined. The encomendero was legally required to provide religious instruction to the people under his charge. In practice, this meant supporting the local friar, paying for the church, the school, the religious supplies. The friar, in turn, depended on the encomendero for material support. This created an uncomfortable partnership between the man of God and the man of tribute, between the cross and the tax collector. The friars were caught in an impossible position. They depended on the colonial system for their survival, their travel, their supplies. Their very presence in the Philippines was funded by the Spanish crown. But they also witnessed, every single day, the suffering that system inflicted on their converts. Some friars looked the other way, but others did not. And the one who refused most fiercely to look away was about to arrive. On September 17, 1581, a Dominican friar named Domingo de Salazar stepped off a ship in Manila Bay and into the most turbulent chapter of early Philippine church history. Salazar was 69 years old. He had spent decades as a missionary in Mexico and Florida, including an ill-fated expedition to Florida with Tristan de Ayllón between 1558 and 1561, after which he served as prior at monasteries in Oaxaca and Puebla. He had studied at the University of Salamanca, the greatest intellectual center in Spain, under the philosopher Francisco de Vitoria, the man widely considered the founder of international law. Vitoria's teachings had planted a radical idea in Salazar's mind, that indigenous peoples had natural rights that could not be violated, not even by the authority of the Pope or the King. And Salazar had been deeply influenced by the ideas of Bartolomé de las Casas, the famous protector of the Indians who had spent his life denouncing Spanish cruelty. In the Americas, Philip II chose Salazar as the first bishop of Manila for a specific reason. Reports had been reaching Spain about the abuses being committed in the Philippines. The excessive tributes, the forced labor, the violence against indigenous communities. The moral crisis that Las Casas had provoked regarding the Americas was now repeating itself in Asia. The king needed someone with the moral authority and the intellectual firepower to bring order to the chaos. Salazar was that someone, but Salazar was initially reluctant to accept As he later wrote, one of the reasons which made me accept this bishopric was the fact that these islands are near China. For a long time, I have had the conversion of that kingdom at heart, and with that thought I came to these islands. Even at 69, his missionary ambition burned bright. He dreamed not just of the Philippines, but of China beyond. He set out for Manila via Acapulco, taking with him 20 Dominicans for the journey. 12 of them did not survive the voyage from Spain to Mexico. Of the 8 who reached Mexico, only one, Fray Cristobal de Salvatierra, was able to continue the journey to the Philippines. The rest were too ill or too broken to go on. Think about that. Out of 20 Dominican companions who set out with Salazar, only one made it to Manila. The attrition rate of missionaries in this era was staggering. He arrived with his sole surviving Dominican, along with an entourage that tells you everything about the multinational character of the early Philippine Church: 18 Augustinians, 6 Franciscans, 3 Jesuits, the first Jesuits ever to set foot in the Philippines, and 7 secular priests. Salazar wasted no time. Within months of his arrival, he erected a temporary cathedral in Manila just before Christmas 1581. And then, in 1582, he did something that would send shockwaves through the entire colony. He convened the Synod of Manila. A synod is a formal assembly of church leaders, gathered to address pressing questions of faith and governance. What made the Manila Synod of 1582 extraordinary was not its format. Synods happened all the time in Catholic territories. What made it extraordinary was its conclusions. After hearing testimony from friars, missionaries, soldiers, administrators, and Filipino leaders, the Synod arrived at a series of findings that essentially put the entire Spanish colonial enterprise on trial. First, the Spanish had no just cause to seize native lands. The only legitimate reason for Spain's presence in the Philippines was the preaching of the gospel. Second, the collection of tribute from indigenous communities was unjust because it had been imposed by force without the free consent of those being taxed. Third, restitution was required. This meant that every conquistador, every encomendero, every official who had taken property or labor from Filipinos was morally obligated to pay it all back, not partially, in full. Fourth, any confessor who absolved a Spaniard without requiring restitution was himself guilty of sin. These were not gentle suggestions, these were formal decrees, announced publicly in the cathedral by Bishop Salazar himself. And the reaction was exactly what you would expect. The colony exploded with rage. Governor Ronquillo, the civil authority in Manila, was furious. The encomenderos were outraged. One man reportedly walked up to a friar and struck him in the face. Another sent a message to Salazar warning him to moderate his zeal, because, the man boasted, he was perfectly capable of hitting a bishop's mitre at 50 paces with an arquebus, a death threat, against a bishop. For defending Filipino farmers, the Jesuit Father Hernan Suarez, writing to his superiors in Rome 3 years after the Synod, reported that most of the conquistadors in Manila had not been to confession. Since the decrees were announced, they refused to confess because confession now required them to give back what they had stolen, and they were not willing to give back anything. In 1586, Salazar wrote a long letter to King Philip II, laying out the situation with the clarity and urgency of a man who knew he was running out of time. He described how the conquerors, who had committed injustices, were still alive, and so were the Filipinos they had wronged. He pleaded with the king to intervene, to compel restitution, to hold his own subjects accountable for what they had done. But the distance between Manila and Madrid was not just geographical, it was temporal. A letter took a year to cross the ocean. A response took another year to come back. And in that 2-year gap, the governor would write his own version of events, contradicting everything Salazar had said the king sat in his palace in Madrid, receiving two completely different accounts of the same situation, with no way to determine which was true. Some of the synod's more radical provisions proved impossible to enforce. The requirement that each conquistador pay restitution in solidum, meaning each individual was liable for the total amount owed by all, was eventually softened. The bishop relented and allowed each man to pay only his individual share. But even this compromise was bitterly contested. Salazar did not back down on the fundamental principle. He continued to write letters to King Philip II, documenting the abuses in agonizing detail. But the communication between Manila and Madrid was painfully slow. Letters took a year or more to cross the ocean, and by the time a response arrived, the situation had already changed. The governor would write his own letters denying everything. The king received contradictory reports and had no way to verify them. It was a maddening, heartbreaking struggle. Salazar was trying to hold an empire accountable from the other side of the world, armed with nothing but his pen, his conscience, and the authority of his office. The confrontation continued through the 1580s and into the 1590s. Salazar clashed with governor after governor, first Ronquillo, then Gomez Perez das Marinas. He invited the Dominican order to the Philippines in 1587. Knowing he needed more allies in the fight, he established a college, opened a hospital, and continued to argue, plead, and demand justice for the Filipino people. Finally, in 1591, at the age of nearly 80, Salazar made a decision that would be his last great act of courage. He boarded a ship and sailed back to Spain, a journey of several months across two oceans, to plead the Filipino cause in person before the king. Think about that for a moment. An old man, nearly 80 years old, undertaking one of the most dangerous voyages on earth, not for gold, not for glory, not for personal gain, but because he believed that the people of the Philippines deserved justice, and he was running out of time to secure it. Accompanying him was a younger Dominican named Miguel de Benavides, who would later become famous as the founder of the University of Santo Tomas, the oldest existing university in Asia. Together, Salazar and Benavides traveled to the Spanish court. They argued their case, they presented evidence, and they achieved real results. Salazar secured the re-establishment of the audiencia, the colonial court, which gave the Philippines a judicial system. Independent of the governor's authority, he obtained the creation of new bishoprics across the islands. His advocacy led directly to the establishment of the Philippines as an autonomous ecclesiastical province in 1595, with Manila as its archdiocese. But Salazar would never see the Philippines again. Exhausted by the journey, weakened by age and decades of struggle, he passed away in Madrid on December 4, 1594, at the age of 82. His tomb in the Church of Santo Tomas in Madrid bears an inscription that captures the essence of his life in a single sentence. Here lies the most loving shepherd of his flock, the father of the poor, himself truly a poor man. Later generations would give him a title that links him to the greatest defender of indigenous rights in all of Spanish colonial history, the Los Cauces of the Philippines. What Salazar proved, what his entire life demonstrated, was that from its very first generation, the Philippine Catholic Church contained within itself a voice of dissent, a voice that said, the gospel cannot be spread by the sword, faith cannot be imposed by force, and the people of these islands are not subjects to be exploited. They are children of God, worthy of dignity and justice. That voice would echo through Philippine history for the next 500 years, from the Manila Synod of 1582 to the Revolution of 1896. From the People Power Revolution of 1986 to the social justice advocacy of the Church today, the DNA of Bishop Salazar is woven into the very fabric of what it means to be a Filipino Catholic. While bishops argued with governors and friars debated the morality of empire. Something extraordinary was happening across the Philippine landscape. Churches were rising, not temporary structures of bamboo and palm fronds, but massive, permanent buildings of stone, coral, and brick. Buildings designed to last centuries, and which have lasted centuries. The story of Philippine church architecture is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of the Catholic faith, because these buildings were not simply places of worship. They were fortresses, they were schools, they were hospitals, they were community centers, and in many remote areas, the parish church was the only structure of permanence in a world shaped by typhoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and pirate raids. Consider the timeline of San Agustin Church in Manila, the oldest stone church still standing in the Philippines, in 1571. The Augustinians built their first church on the site, a humble structure of bamboo and nipa palm, barely more than a hut with a cross on top. In 1574, it was destroyed by fire during the attack of the Chinese pirate Limahong, who raided Manila with a fleet of 62 ships and nearly overran the young Spanish settlement. They rebuilt, this time in wood, but what was still vulnerable. In 1586, they began construction of a stone church using hewn adobe and coral, following designs influenced by Augustinian churches in Puebla, Mexico, the same colonial pipeline that had brought the friars themselves. The construction was a monumental effort, requiring Filipino and Chinese laborers working for decades, under the direction of Spanish architects. In 1607, the massive stone edifice we know today was completed, and it has stood ever since. Through earthquakes that cracked the walls and toppled one of its two bell towers in 1880, the damaged tower had to be permanently removed, which is why San Agustin today has only one. Through the British invasion of 1762, when occupying soldiers looted its treasures, through the devastating Battle of Manila in February 1945, when the entire district of Intramuros was reduced to rubble by American and Japanese bombardment. A battle so destructive that Manila became one of the most devastated cities of World War II, second only to Warsaw. San Agustin Church was the only building in Intramuros to survive. Inside, the church still preserves its magnificent trompe-l'oeil ceiling frescoes, painted illusions that make a flat ceiling appear to have three-dimensional architectural features, creating the impression of vaulting and depth. These paintings, created by Italian and Filipino artists, survived everything that destroyed the world around them. They are still there today, looking down on worshippers just as they have for centuries. How does a 400-year-old building withstand bombs that destroyed everything around it? The answer lies in a style of architecture that is unique to the Philippines and parts of Latin America, a style known as earthquake baroque. The Philippines sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most seismically active zones on the planet. The Spanish missionaries learned very quickly that European cathedral designs, with their soaring spires and thin walls, would not survive here, so they adapted, they innovated, and they created something new. Earthquake baroque is characterized by massive buttresses, thick stone supports that brace the walls of the church from the outside, absorbing the lateral forces of an earthquake. The walls themselves are enormously thick, sometimes reaching 2.5 meters. The building materials are deliberately chosen for strength. Coral stone blocks, which are approximately twice as strong as ordinary brick, combined with adobe and volcanic stone. The finest example of earthquake baroque in the Philippines is the Church of San Agustin in Paui, Ilocos Norte, built beginning in 1694 and completed in 1710. This church features 14 enormous buttresses that line the sides and back of the building, like the flying roots of a giant banyan tree. The coral stone bell tower stands at some distance from the main church, deliberately separated so that if the tower collapses during an earthquake, it will not bring down the sanctuary. Paui Church has survived every major earthquake to hit northern Luzon in the past 300 years. It is engineering genius expressed in stone and faith. But there is another style of Philippine church architecture that tells a different story. Not of earthquakes, but of human conflict. This is Fortress Baroque. The Church of Santo Tomas de Villanueva in Mayagao, Iloilo, was built in 1786 quite literally as a fortress. The town of Mayagao had been raided and burned by Moro pirates twice, in 1741 and 1754. And when the townspeople rebuilt, they were determined that their church would never be vulnerable again. The resulting structure has walls of limestone, coral, and adobe thick enough to withstand cannon fire. The twin bell towers served as lookout posts against approaching raiders. Secret passages ran through the walls. This was a church where you went to pray, and where you went to survive. But what makes the Mayagao Church truly remarkable is not its military function. It is its facade. The front of the church is a riot of carved stone, a visual narrative created by local Filipino artisans who took European decorative conventions and transformed them into something unmistakably Filipino. At the center of the facade stands the figure of Saint Christopher, carrying the Christ child on his back. But this is not the Saint Christopher of European tradition, wading through a European river, holding a European staff. This Saint Christopher is dressed in native Filipino clothing. He holds onto a coconut palm for support, and he is surrounded not by European grapevines and oak leaves, but by Philippine papaya trees, guava, and tropical flora. This is not European Baroque transplanted to Asia. This is Filipino Baroque, European forms reimagined through Filipino eyes, carved by Filipino hands, expressing Filipino faith. UNESCO recognized this when it inscribed for Philippine Baroque churches as a World Heritage Site in 1993, noting that they represent a reinterpretation of European Baroque by Chinese and Philippine craftsmen. These churches were built by Filipino and Chinese laborers under the direction of Spanish friars. But the artistry, the adaptation, the creative genius of making something local out of something foreign, that was entirely Filipino. And it is a perfect metaphor for what happened to Catholicism itself in the Philippines. Now we arrive at the most complex, most sensitive, and perhaps most important part of our story. Because the encounter between Catholicism and the indigenous spiritual traditions of the Philippines was not a simple replacement. It was not, old religion goes out, new religion comes in. It was something far more nuanced, far more human, and far more beautiful than that. Before the Spanish arrived, the people of the Philippines followed a rich and varied set of spiritual traditions that scholars now collectively refer to as indigenous Philippine folk religions. These traditions varied from island to island, from mountain to coast, from community to community. But the historian T. Valentino Sitoy, reviewing the available records, identified three core characteristics that were shared across the archipelago. First, Filipinos believed in the existence of a parallel spirit world, invisible but constantly influencing the visible world. Second, Filipinos believed that spirits, called Dewata, existed everywhere, from the highest creator god to minor spirits inhabiting trees, rocks, rivers, and caves. Third, Filipinos believed that events in the human world were shaped by the actions and interventions of these spirit beings. This worldview had a striking structural similarity to Catholic theology. Catholicism also posits an invisible spiritual realm that influences the visible world. Catholicism also has a hierarchy of spiritual beings, God at the summit, then angels, then saints, then the souls of the faithful departed. And Catholicism also teaches that events in the human world are influenced by divine providence. This similarity was not a coincidence, and it was not superficial. It was a deep structural resonance that made Catholicism more accessible to Filipinos than it was to, say, the Confucian scholars of China or the Buddhist monks of Japan, whose philosophical frameworks were fundamentally different. Consider the specific parallels. The supreme deity in pre-colonial Tagalog belief was Bafala, the creator of all things, the ultimate source of power. The Catholic missionaries introduced a God who was also the creator of all things, the ultimate source of power for many Filipinos. Bafala and the Christian God were not opposites. They were recognitions of the same reality, expressed in different languages. The Dewata, nature spirits who inhabited every corner of the physical world, found their counterparts in the Catholic saints. Saints in Catholic tradition are intercessors, holy men and women who, having lived virtuous lives on earth, now dwell in the presence of God and can hear the prayers of the faithful. For Filipinos accustomed to addressing requests to specific Dewata for specific needs, this spirit for good harvests, that spirit for safe travels, the idea of patron saints was immediately intuitive. And the Onito, ancestral spirits, the honored dead who continued to watch over their descendants, found their echo in the Catholic practices of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, when the Church officially honors the departed and prays for their eternal rest. Even the sacraments were received through the lens of existing belief. Baptism, as we discussed, was understood by many Filipinos as a healing ritual, because their own traditions also used the symbolic power of water for spiritual cleansing. The sacrament of the anointing of the sick, given to those near the end of their earthly journey, was particularly welcomed, because it resonated with the indigenous practice of performing sacred rites for the dying, to ease their passage to the spirit world. The sacrament of matrimony required significant negotiation before the Spanish arrived. Filipino customs included polygamy for those of high status, divorce by mutual consent, and cohabitation before formal marriage, all of which the Catholic Church officially forbade. The missionaries had to make difficult choices. They tolerated the tradition of the groom providing a bride price to the bride's family, even though some friars saw it as a father selling his daughter. They tolerated the practice of couples living together before the wedding ceremony, even though it contradicted Catholic teaching on chastity. These concessions were not made out of weakness, but out of pragmatism. The missionaries understood that demanding total conformity to European marriage customs would have made the sacrament completely unacceptable, and no marriages would have taken place at all. The official Spanish policy was to permit any indigenous custom that did not brazenly conflict with basic Christian morality. This was not a policy of total cultural destruction. It was a policy of selective accommodation, and it created the space within which something extraordinary could grow. These parallels did not escape the Filipino people. They saw them, understood them, and used them to create something that the missionaries never intended and never fully controlled. A synthesis, a fusion, a creative blending of two spiritual traditions that produced something new. This is what scholars call folk Catholicism, and it is one of the most remarkable spiritual phenomena in the history of Christianity. The Babaylan, the traditional spiritual leaders, often women, who served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, were officially suppressed by the Spanish missionaries. Their rituals were banned, their sacred objects were destroyed, their authority was systematically undermined. But the Babaylan did not disappear, they evolved. They became the Albulario, folk healers who combined indigenous healing techniques with Catholic prayers and symbols. The Albulario would recite Catholic orachones instead of traditional invocations, use holy water instead of sacred herbal preparations, and invoke the names of saints instead of ancestral spirits. The form changed, the function did not. To this day, The albilario remains a respected figure in many Filipino communities, a living bridge between the pre-colonial past and the Catholic present. The aning-aning, traditional amulets believed to provide supernatural protection, underwent a similar transformation, where pre-colonial aning-aning might have been inscribed with indigenous symbols and empowered by Babylon rituals. Post-conversion aning-aning were inscribed with Latin prayers and Catholic images. A crucifix worn around the neck served the same protective function as the old talismans. The theology had changed, but the spiritual logic had not. Even the great Catholic festivals of the Philippines bear the marks of this synthesis. The Obando fertility dance, celebrated annually in Bulacan, is recognized as a Catholic feast day, but its origins lie in the Casilinawan, a pre-colonial dance performed by spiritual leaders in honor of indigenous nature deities. The dance survived because it was adapted, reframed, and given a Catholic context. The ancestors are still there, moving beneath the surface. The Ilocano tradition of autumn, leaving food offerings for ancestral spirits, continues to this day, coexisting comfortably with Catholic practice. It is not seen as contradicting the faith. It is seen as complementing it. Now, the Spanish missionaries were not unaware of this blending. Many of them were deeply troubled by it, from the perspective of Orthodox Catholic theology. Some of these practices crossed the line from legitimate devotion into superstition or even idolatry. There were vigorous debates within the missionary orders about how to respond. Some friars took a hard line, attempting to root out every trace of pre-colonial belief. They burned indigenous religious texts. They destroyed dambana, traditional places of worship. They confiscated and smashed statues of ancestral spirits. Some of the cruelest cultural losses in Philippine history, the destruction of pre-colonial manuscripts written in the Baybayin script, for example, occurred during this period, but other friars took a more nuanced approach. They recognized that some Filipino customs, while unfamiliar, did not actually contradict Catholic teaching. The tradition of the groom providing a bride price, for example, was initially rejected by some missionaries, but eventually tolerated because it did not violate any fundamental moral principle. The practice of communal feasting to celebrate religious occasions was actively encouraged, because it reinforced community bonds and gave the new faith a joyful, celebratory character. The official Spanish policy, such as it was, could be summarized as, permit any indigenous custom that does not brazenly conflict with basic Christian morality. This was not a policy of total destruction. It was a policy of selective accommodation, and it created the space in which folk Catholicism could grow. Was this a betrayal of Catholic orthodoxy, or was it the genius of inculturation? The process by which the gospel takes root in a new culture by expressing itself through that culture's own language, symbols, and traditions? The Filipino theologian Jose M. D. Mesa has argued persuasively that folk Catholicism, far from being a corruption of true faith, actually served as a shield that protected indigenous Filipino culture from complete destruction. By incorporating elements of their ancestral beliefs into their Catholic practice, Filipinos preserve something of what the colonizers tried to erase. Folk Catholicism was not confusion, it was cultural survival. And this is perhaps the most profound answer to the question we asked at the beginning of this story. Why did the Philippines become Catholic in a way that no other Asian nation did? It was not because the Spanish were more powerful here than elsewhere. They tried just as hard in China and Japan and failed spectacularly. It was not because Filipinos were passive or easily conquered. The history of resistance, from Lapu-Lapu to the Tamlet Uprising to the Daguhoy Rebellion, proves otherwise. The Philippines became Catholic because the Filipino people found in Catholicism a spiritual framework that resonated with their existing beliefs. And then they did what Filipinos have always done with foreign influences. They adapted it, localized it, made it their own. and created something that was neither purely indigenous nor purely European, but authentically, irreducibly Filipino. By the end of the 16th century, just 35 years after those 5 Augustinian friars stepped onto the beach at Cebu, the landscape of the Philippines had been transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Augustinians alone had established 44 monasteries staffed by 130 missionaries. By the first quarter of the 17th century, these would grow to 50 houses with 155 priests and 13 lay brothers. Over the entire course of the Spanish colonial period, 2,368 Augustinian friars would come to the Philippines, founding 385 towns and ministering to more than 2 million souls. But those staggering numbers all trace back to those first 5 men on the beach at Cebu in 1565. The Franciscans, who arrived in 1578, had spread into the Tagalog regions and the Bicol Peninsula, building beautiful churches in Lacban, Tayabas, Pacal, and Pete. One Franciscan friar, Fray Felix Huerta, would later run the San Lazaro Hospital, found the Monte de Piedad Savings Bank, and establish the first water system to supply Manila with safe drinking water, accomplishments that went far beyond the spiritual realm. The Jesuits, arriving in 1581 alongside Bishop Salazar, had begun their educational mission that would eventually produce some of the most important institutions of learning in Philippine history. The Dominicans, arriving in 1587 at Salazar's invitation, had taken responsibility for the Chinese community in Manila, establishing the Holy Rosary Church in Binondo in 1596, the oldest Chinatown church in the world, and the Hospital de San Gabriel for Chinese residents. They were already looking toward the evangelization of China and Japan, dreaming of a faith that would spread from Manila across all of East Asia. In 1594, the Spanish government formally divided the archipelago among the religious orders. To prevent overlap and competition, the Augustinians took the Visayas, parts of the Tagalog country, Pampanga, and the Ilocos coast. The Franciscans took southern Luzon. The Jesuits received parts of the Visayas and Mindanao. The Dominicans took the Cagayan Valley and northern Luzon. This partition created a system in which the friar was often the only Spanish authority figure. In a given community, the friar was not just the priest. He was the teacher, the judge, the administrator, the doctor, and the voice of the colonial government. This concentration of power in the hands of religious orders would eventually become a source of enormous controversy. The phenomenon known as friarocracy, or the rule of the friars, which would fuel the revolutionary movements of the 19th century. But that is a story for another time. What matters for our purposes is what those first 35 years accomplished and what they cost. They accomplished the creation of the foundation upon which Philippine Catholicism would stand for the next 5 centuries. The churches, the parishes, the schools, the hospitals, the linguistic records, the legal precedents, the theological debates, all of these were laid down between 1565 and 1600. And what they cost was measured not in gold or silver, but in the disruption of ancient ways of life, the suppression of indigenous spiritual traditions, the displacement of communities from their ancestral lands, and the suffering inflicted by a colonial system that used the cross as both a blessing and a weapon. But here is what makes Philippine Catholicism so remarkable, so resilient, so uniquely alive. It was born in that tension. It was not imported as a finished product. It was forged in the collision between 2 worlds, and the Filipino people, with their extraordinary capacity for adaptation, synthesis, and creative resistance, shaped it into something that belongs to no one else. This is not Spanish Catholicism in a tropical setting. This is Filipino Catholicism, a faith that carries the Santo Niño in joyful procession through the streets of Cebu. that dances the sinologue in honor of the Christ child, that leaves food offerings for ancestors on the same table where rosary beads rest, that builds churches strong enough to survive earthquakes and beautiful enough to take your breath away, that produced a bishop willing to defy an empire for the sake of justice, and that, 500 years later, still moves the hearts of more than 80 million people. So what can we learn from all of this? I think the first lesson is about complexity. It is tempting to tell this story as either a triumph or a tragedy, either the glorious rival of the true faith or the cruel imposition of a foreign religion. But the truth is that it was both, simultaneously, and that acknowledging both does not diminish either. The faith of those first Augustinian friars was genuine. Erdonata really did risk his life to chart a route across the Pacific. Rada really did learn Filipino languages and defend Filipino rights. Salazar really did sacrifice everything to argue for justice. These were not villains. They were complicated men living in complicated times, trying to serve God in a system that was often profoundly unjust. And the response of the Filipino people was equally genuine. Those who accepted baptism were not simply submitting to a foreign power. Many of them found in Catholicism a spiritual language that spoke to truths they already knew. And those who resisted, the Babaylan who led uprisings, the communities who fled into the mountains, the families who secretly maintained their ancestral rituals, were not rejecting God. They were defending their right to encounter the divine on their own terms. The second lesson is about resilience. The Philippines has been colonized by Spain, by America, by Japan. It has been shaken by earthquakes, battered by typhoons, and tested by every conceivable challenge. And through all of it, the faith endured, not because it was imposed from outside, but because Filipinos made it their own. They wove it into the fabric of their culture so tightly that it cannot be separated, without unraveling everything. And the third lesson, the one that matters most, is about identity. Filipino Catholicism is not a copy. It is not a derivative. It is not a lesser version of European Christianity. It is one of the most vibrant, creative, and deeply felt expressions of the Catholic faith anywhere in the world. It is a faith that was born in struggle, shaped by resistance, enriched by indigenous wisdom, and sanctified by the blood and tears of generations. I want to add a personal thought here. When I look at this history, I see something that I think every Filipino should be proud of. Not the colonization, obviously, and not the suffering that came with it, but the response. The Filipino response to the encounter with Catholicism was not passive acceptance. It was active creation. Our ancestors did not simply receive a foreign faith. They interrogated it. They tested it against their own spiritual experience. They kept what resonated and quietly preserved what the missionaries tried to destroy. They transformed European saints into Filipino protectors. They wove the rhythms of the church calendar into the rhythms of the planting season. They built churches that could survive earthquakes and decorated them with coconut palms instead of grapevines. That is not the behavior of a conquered people. That is the behavior of a people with an unbreakable creative spirit. And that spirit, the ability to take something foreign and make it genuinely, irreducibly our own, is perhaps the most Filipino thing there is. It is the same spirit that turns American basketball into a national obsession, played on every street corner. The same spirit that takes English and Spanish words and weaves them into the beautiful hybrid melody of Taglish. The same spirit that turns a colonial religion into a living faith, that moves the hearts of over 80 million people. That is who we are. That is what 500 years of history has made us. And no matter where in the world a Filipino might find themselves, in a church in Manila, in a chapel in Saudi Arabia, in a living room in California with a candlelit before a small statue of the Santo Niño, that spirit is there, that faith is there, that unbroken thread, stretching all the way back to 1565, to 5 monks on a beach in Cebu, to a wooden statue found in the ashes, to a god who was waiting. In 2025, the world witnessed something that brought this entire history full circle. Robert Francis Prevost, an Augustinian friar with deep and personal ties to the Philippines, was elected as Pope Leo XIV, an Augustinian, the same order that sent 5 friars to Cebu in 1565, the same order that built the first churches, wrote the first grammars, and lit the first candle of faith in these islands. 500 years later, the flame is still burning, and it is burning in Filipino. That is the true miracle of this story. Not the Santo Niño surviving 44 years in a burned hut. Not Urdaneta charting 12,000 miles of open ocean. Not San Agustin Church standing alone in the ruins of Intramuros. The true miracle is that a faith brought by 5 monks on 5 ships to an archipelago 7,000 islands took root so deeply that 500 years later, it is inseparable from the very identity of the Filipino people. A faith that was carried by the sword but transformed by the heart. A faith that was tested by empire but refined by resistance. A faith that endures. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it showed you something about our history that you did not know before, then please share it. Share it with your family. Share it with someone who has never heard about Bishop Salazar or Father Urdaneta, or the incredible Filipino artisans who carved coconut palms into the facade of a church. Because this is our story. This is who we are. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me what part of this story surprised you the most. And if you have not yet seen our episode about the first Mass in the Philippines and the miracle of the Santo Niño, go watch it now. It is the beginning of this entire journey. Thank you for spending this time with me. Salamat po. God bless the Philippines. And God bless the faith that made us who we are.